He was chosen by God, anointed by a prophet, and given a kingdom he never asked for. He stood head and shoulders above every other man in Israel, literally. He had everything a person could want: power, legitimacy, and the admiration of an entire nation. And yet, King Saul spent the final years of his reign hunting down a shepherd boy. Not an army. Not a rival king. A shepherd boy who played the harp. That is the question this video is really asking. Not what David did to Saul, but what was already inside Saul that David's rise was able to expose. Because the story of Saul is not really a story about losing a kingdom. It is a story about what insecurity does to a person when they have too much power and too fragile a sense of self. And when you look at it through that lens, Saul stops being a distant biblical figure. He starts looking uncomfortably familiar. When we first meet Saul, he is not looking for power. He is looking for lost donkeys. He is wandering around the countryside doing his father's errands when the prophet Samuel pulls him aside and changes his life forever. And Saul's first response is not ambition or excitement. It is confusion. He says, "Why me? My tribe is the smallest. My family is the least significant. There must be a mistake." That humility reads as noble at first. But it is worth paying attention to. Because there is a kind of person who genuinely does not believe they deserve what they have been given, and when the world confirms their worst fear, when someone more gifted arrives, that early voice of self-doubt comes roaring back. Saul's humility was never really resolved. It was just buried under a crown. He starts well. He shows restraint, military courage, moments of real leadership. Israel is proud of him. Samuel is proud of him. And for a time, it seems like the story of a man who grew into something greater than he believed he could be. Then it begins to fracture. The cracks don't start with David. They start earlier with Saul's relationship to authority. Twice he disobeys direct instructions. Once before a battle, he performs a sacrifice he had no authority to perform, because he was afraid the people would scatter. Once after a victory, he keeps what he was commanded to destroy. Both times he has a reason. Both times, the reason sounds logical. And both times, what is actually driving him is fear. Fear of losing the crowd. Fear of going home empty-handed. Fear of looking weak. Samuel tells him something that sounds like a theological judgment, but is actually a psychological diagnosis. He says, "Because you did not trust, the kingdom will not remain with you." Saul's problem was never cruelty. It was not ambition in the way we usually mean it. His problem was that he needed approval more than he needed integrity. He needed to be seen as strong more than he needed to actually be strong. And that gap between the image and the reality is exactly where insecurity lives. Then David walks in. And everything Saul was managing on the inside suddenly becomes impossible to contain. David kills Goliath. The army celebrates. And on the way home, the women of the cities come out singing. Their song is simple. Saul has killed his thousands, and David his 10,000s. That is it. That is the whole thing. A victory song. A celebration. Not a threat. Not a challenge. Just a song. But Saul does not hear a song. He hears a verdict. He hears the future happening without him. He hears his replacement being announced in public, in front of everyone, set to music. And something shifts in him in that moment that never fully shifts back. The text says he was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And then it says he eyed David from that day forward. Eyed him. That is not a casual observation. That is surveillance. That is the beginning of obsession. This is one of the most psychologically precise moments in the entire Bible. Because what Saul experiences in that moment is not just jealousy in the ordinary sense. It is the particular agony of a person who has built their entire identity around a role, and suddenly feels that role slipping. And what makes it so destabilizing is that David has done nothing wrong. David is loyal. David is gifted. David loves Saul. He plays music to soothe him. He fights Saul's battles. He wins Saul's wars. David is, by every measure, everything Saul would have wanted in a son. And that is exactly the problem. Insecurity does not respond rationally to goodness. It responds to threat. And in the logic of a wounded ego, the more excellent David becomes, the more dangerous he is. Saul cannot celebrate David without feeling diminished by him. He cannot trust David's loyalty because he cannot stop measuring David's glory against his own. Every victory David wins is processed not as a benefit to the kingdom, but as another piece of evidence that the kingdom no longer needs Saul. This is the distortion that insecurity creates. It turns allies into rivals. It turns admiration into suspicion. It turns the people you should protect into the people you feel most threatened by. And once that distortion takes hold, it reshapes everything: the way Saul reads situations, the way he interprets silence, the way he understands kindness. Everything David does becomes something to be decoded for hidden motive. Saul begins to unravel in ways that are visible to everyone around him. He throws a spear at David twice while David is playing music to calm him down. He sends David on increasingly dangerous military missions, not to develop him, but hoping he will die in the field. He promises David his daughter in marriage, then gives her to someone else. He uses his own children, his son Jonathan, his daughter Michal, as instruments of manipulation, and when they choose David over him, he feels the betrayal not just politically but personally. Even his family is choosing the wrong king. There is a cruelty in this, but it is not the clean cruelty of a villain. It is the cruelty of a man who is terrified, and who cannot stop making decisions from that terror. Saul never stops believing he is justified. He always has a reason. He always has a story about why this threat is real, why this enemy deserves to be eliminated, why what he is doing is necessary. Insecure people rarely see themselves as insecure. They see themselves as responding correctly to a world that keeps attacking them. That is what makes it so hard to help someone in this state, and so dangerous to be near them. By the time Saul is consulting a medium at Endor, asking a dead man what to do because God has stopped answering, you are not watching a king anymore. You are watching the final stages of a collapse that began with a song. A man who was once anointed, once promising, once genuinely chosen, sitting in darkness, dressed in disguise, talking to ghosts. The image is not triumphant. It is devastatingly sad. He dies the next day, not in glory, on his own sword. And here is what stays with you when the story is over. Saul did not have to end this way. He had the resources. He had the position. He had, at one point, the Spirit of God. What he did not have was the internal security to let someone else be great without feeling erased by it. He could not hold both truths at once: that David was gifted, and that Saul still had worth. His identity was too fragile to share the room with someone who might outshine him. And so he spent everything: his reign, his relationships, his sanity, his sons, his legacy, trying to stop something that was never actually going to destroy him. David did not want Saul's throne. Not once did David raise a hand against him. But Saul could not survive what David represented, because what David represented was a version of greatness that Saul had never been able to feel settled inside himself. That is the quiet devastation of insecurity at that level. It does not need an enemy to destroy you. It will use your gifts, your position, your fear, your intelligence, and your own hand to do the work. Saul was not brought down by David. He was brought down by the part of himself that could never quite believe he was enough, and could not bear for anyone else to be more. The kingdom does not always fall to an invader. Sometimes it collapses from the inside, one comparison at a time.